Home-generated electricity can reduce dependence on the grid, but only when the household is actually supplying part of its energy from another source. Simply storing grid electricity and using it later does not create true independence. That distinction matters because home-generated power can describe several very different setups. Some systems capture energy from sunlight. Others convert energy from fuel. Some store electricity in batteries. Others combine generation, storage, and power management into one system. From the outside, these systems can look similar. A compact unit sits in a garage or utility room. A refrigerator stays on. A phone charges. Lights continue working. But the important question is not what the box looks like. It is where the electricity came from. That is where most confusion starts. Imagine a household trying to reduce its dependence on the electrical grid. The family has already cut unnecessary consumption. Lights are turned off when they are not needed. The thermostat is adjusted more carefully. Devices are unplugged. Appliances are used more efficiently. Those efforts may reduce the amount of electricity consumed, but the house is still receiving the remaining electricity from the same external grid. So the family is using less power without necessarily becoming more independent. That difference is easy to overlook. Reducing consumption and reducing grid dependence are related, but they are not identical. A household can consume relatively little electricity and still depend on the utility for every watt it uses. The real issue isn't how little electricity the household uses. It's how much of the electricity it still needs comes from somewhere other than the grid. That changes the entire conversation. If a home generates part of its own electricity from a legitimate independent source, that energy can potentially replace electricity that would otherwise have been purchased from the utility. Solar is the easiest example to understand. Sunlight reaches the panels. The panels convert that energy into electricity. The electricity can be used immediately by the home, stored for later, or managed according to the design of the system. When that locally generated electricity powers a household device, the grid does not have to supply that same amount at that moment. That is a real reduction in grid dependence. But now consider a battery that is charged entirely from the utility. The battery fills with electricity from the grid. Later, the household disconnects from the grid temporarily and uses the battery. The appliances are still running from stored electricity, but the original source was the utility. The battery changed when the electricity was used. It did not create an independent energy source. That can still be extremely useful. During an outage, stored electricity may keep communication devices, lights, refrigeration, or other selected loads operating. But backup capability and energy independence are not the same thing. This is the hidden structural layer behind many home energy systems. Generation answers one question: where is the energy coming from? Storage answers another: when can that energy be used? Power conversion answers another: can the electricity be delivered in a form household devices can use? And capacity answers another: how long can the system continue? All four matter. A household could generate electricity from an independent source but have no practical way to store excess energy. Another household could have excellent battery storage but still rely entirely on grid electricity to charge it. A third system might combine independent generation with storage, allowing some household needs to be supported even when grid power is unavailable. Those are fundamentally different structures. And this is why the phrase home-generated electricity should always lead to a more specific question. Generated from what? Once the source is clear, the next issue is demand. A home is not one electrical load. It contains many. LED lights and phone chargers may require relatively little power. Routers and small electronics may also be manageable. Refrigerators can require more, especially when compressors start. Electric heating, cooking, water heating, and central air conditioning can demand much more. This means reducing grid dependence does not necessarily require replacing all household electricity at once. A smaller system might cover only selected loads. If it supplies some of those loads from an independent source, grid dependence has still been reduced. That may be a more realistic goal than trying to become completely self-sufficient. Think of grid dependence as a percentage rather than an on or off condition. At one extreme, the household gets everything from the utility. At the other extreme, it produces and manages all of its own electricity. Between those points are many partial arrangements. A family might generate enough independent power to support basic lighting and communication. Another might cover refrigeration. Another might offset part of normal daytime usage. Another might maintain a separate reserve for outages. Each reduces dependence in a different way. But there is another limitation: timing. Energy production and energy demand do not always happen at the same moment. Solar generation, for example, depends on available sunlight. Household demand continues into the evening. Without storage or another source, electricity produced at one time may not be available when the household needs it later. That is where batteries become valuable. Not because they generate electricity, because they shift availability. They allow energy produced earlier to be used later. This is also why a system has to be evaluated as a whole. Source, generation, storage, conversion, output, runtime, household load. If one of those pieces is misunderstood, the system can appear more independent than it really is. A short demonstration can be especially misleading. A compact system may power a refrigerator and several small devices for a few minutes. That proves the system can support those loads under those conditions. It does not prove how much electricity was independently generated. It does not prove how long the system can run. And it does not prove that the household's overall grid dependence will fall significantly. Those conclusions require understanding the mechanism. This is why claims about major reductions in power bills deserve careful attention. If the system truly supplies energy from another source, then some grid electricity may be displaced. If the system simply stores utility electricity, the financial effect is different. The useful question is not whether the system sounds innovative. It is what portion of household demand it can actually supply without drawing that electricity from the grid. For many households, partial independence may be more practical than complete independence. Keeping essential devices running during an outage is one goal. Reducing normal grid consumption is another. Producing some electricity locally is another. They can overlap, but they should not be confused. Once those goals are separated, home-generated electricity becomes easier to evaluate. The technology does not need to replace the entire grid to matter. It only needs to provide a real alternative source for some of the electricity the household actually uses. That is where grid dependence begins to change. There is a structured breakdown in the description for anyone who wants to explore home-generated electricity and backup power more carefully. Subscribe for more practical explanations about household energy, grid dependence, and independent power systems. Reducing dependence starts with one question: where is your electricity actually coming from?